Good day, and welcome to the second virtual CEA Regulatory Forum in collaboration with CAMPUT and Natural Resources Canada. I would like to begin by acknowledging the Indigenous peoples of all of the lands that we are on today. While we meet today on a virtual platform, I would like to take a moment to acknowledge the importance of the lands which we all call home. We do this to reaffirm our commitment and responsibility to improving relationships between nations and improving our own understanding of local Indigenous peoples and their cultures. From coast to coast to coast, we acknowledge the ancestral and unceded territory of all of the Inuit, Métis, and First Nations people that call this land home. I would now like to offer a moment of reflection for the 215 children who were discovered at a Kamloops residential school late last week. May we continue to learn and grow from these atrocities as we grapple with our country's difficult and recent history. Thank you. Mon nom est Francis Bradley et je suis le PDG de l'Association canadienne de l'électricité. My name is Francis Bradley and I'm the President and CEO of the Canadian Electricity Association. Our annual regulatory gathering is an opportunity to bring together stakeholders, including provincial and federal government regulators, representatives, consumer and environmental advocates, Indigenous groups, and CEA corporate partners to discuss the impact of regulations on electricity. Our sector is rapidly transforming, and provincial regulations need to allow for the electrification of the Canadian economy. Each of you have an important role to play in this transformation, whether it's through new technology or capital infrastructure development. And at the core of our conversations is the Canadian customer. What does transformation mean for them? Will the Canadian customer continue to receive safe, reliable, sustainable, and affordable power as the system transforms to meet new demand? I look forward to the discussions today that will explore these important questions. Today's virtual event represents the largest regulatory forum ever hosted by CEA, with more than 600 registrants. I'd like to extend my thanks to Cynthia Chaplin of CAMPUT for continuing to support our complimentary event. Those that were able to join the annual CAMPUT meeting back in May, you know of its value. It continues to be a thoughtful and value-added destination in our calendars. I also want to thank Natural Resources Canada for your ongoing support of this regulatory forum. And thank you also to our two sponsors, Domino High Voltage and Siemens, for your support today. Without you, this agenda and the size and scope of our event would not have been possible. I also want to acknowledge our note taker for today's event. Ted Ferguson, the President and CEO of the Delphi Group, will be providing a summary of today's discussion and the key takeaways. This will be provided to all attendees following the event. Now, before we turn things over to our first speakers, I want to thank two of CEA's members specifically. First, our Vice Chair of the Regulatory Committee, Fred James, will be retiring from his role as Chief Regulatory Officer at BC Hydro this month. So congratulations, Fred, and thank you for all your work on behalf of the Canadian electricity sector. And second, a thank you to Indy Butani de Souza, Indy, for your work as chair of our Economic Regulation Innovation Committee. You've been a champion of our work at CEA, and we're eternally grateful for your efforts over the last several years. Today, we welcome Melanie Bailey, President of Electricity at ATCO, to kick things off with a fireside discussion led by Indy. We'll also enjoy two panels on the perspectives on the 4Ds of disruption and the innovative regulatory policies to address the 4Ds. So without further ado, I'd like to turn things over to Indy Butani de Souza, Vice President of Regulatory Affairs and Privacy Office at Electric Utilities. Over to you, Indy.
Thank you so much, Francis. And again, welcome everyone to the CEA's Regulatory Forum. 600 plus registrants tells you that the world of regulatory is far from boring. In fact, our session today will demonstrate exactly how exciting not only the regulatory arena, but the world of electricity and energy more broadly is. Before I go any further, I'm sitting at my home in Toronto, Ontario, as you can see from this not fake background behind me. And I'd like to honor the original people of this land, to say thank you for taking such good care of our mother, the earth, so we could all have a place to call home today. I'd like to say thank you to the Huron peoples, also known as the Wendat Nation, the Haudenosaunee, also known as the Five Nations Confederacy, the Three Fire Confederacy of the Anishinaabe, which includes the Mississaugas of the New Credit. These are the original peoples of this land, and we as settlers and newcomers have a responsibility to honor these people by acknowledging them and taking good care of this land and each other. It is my pleasure to commence today's session with a keynote fireside chat. We should be sitting in armchairs, Melanie, just across from one another, but we will feel fireside as it is toasty here in Southern Ontario. A fireside chat with Melanie Bailey. A brief introduction on Melanie. As Francis said, Melanie is the president of ATCO. She's an engineer and began her career as a civil engineer in Calgary. She started at ATCO in 2000 as a system planning engineer in the natural gas division. Prior to her appointment in her current role, Melanie was the senior vice president and general manager of electricity. Prior to that, she was the chief regulatory officer with accountability and oversight of all regulatory affairs of ATCO's natural gas and electricity utility companies. And of course, in her current role, she has accountability and oversight of ATCO's electricity transmission and distribution businesses that extend in Alberta, the Yukon, and the Northwest Territories. Needless to say, Melanie is extremely busy, but in addition to all of this, she enjoys life with her husband and 2 children just outside of Edmonton in Alberta. So Melanie, welcome. We are going to be commencing with a fireside discussion, and I will be sending questions your way, both those that I have for our chat, as well as those that come to us from the audience. And so, though I think maybe I haven't said it as yet, there is a Slido and an opportunity for our friends in the audience, all 600 of you, or at least some of you, to send questions in, to which we will pick up those questions and then put them to Melanie in our discussion this afternoon. Melanie, perhaps you'd like to begin with an introduction of ATCO and share with us a little bit about your organization.
Thanks, Cindy. I'm just super thrilled to be here. So thanks to you and to the CEA for inviting me to come here and speak with everyone today. I would like to begin by acknowledging that I am too situated on Indigenous land. I'm in Treaty 6 territory, and this land is occupied, traveled, and cared for by Indigenous peoples since time immemorial to the present day. ATCO Electric, my company, is headquartered out of the city of Edmonton, which is where I am today. It's a beautiful hot day here as well. And this is a traditional meeting ground, gathering place, and traveling route of the Cree, Saulteaux, Blackfoot, Dene, Nakota Sioux, and the Métis. The histories, languages, and cultures of Indigenous people continue to enrich our shared heritage. And that's why we acknowledge these things as a reminder that we are all treaty people in Canada, and we are bound to one another by the spirit and intent of treaty. And that's particularly important today in light of the tragic discovery in Kamloops that Francis so poignantly acknowledged for us all before we started today. I think I'll just start with a bit about ATCO, just for some context around some of my remarks today. The ATCO group of companies is in a number of industries, one of which is the utility industry. We are transmission and distribution providers for both natural gas, which is more commonly known as ATCO Gas and Pipelines around the industry, as well as electricity transmission and distribution through ATCO Electric. We own and operate about just under half the interconnected transmission grid in Alberta, and we provide distribution service to customers in northern and central East Alberta. And our 2 subsidiaries in the north, those are vertically integrated utilities, ATCO Electric Yukon and Northland Utilities in the Northwest Territories. And that one is a joint partnership between ATCO and Denendeh Investments, has been for well over 30 years. And the Denendeh Investments Group represents 27 First Nations in the Northwest Territories. So we do have a lot of utility assets in Alberta in the north, about $14 billion invested. And I'll just say we have a rather extensive rural distribution system in our electric utility, about 65,000 kilometers of distribution lines serving 225,000 customers. So very, very low customer density, and we are involved in serving some very remote and rural communities in our service territory. So there are obvious differences among utilities, some very urban, some rural, some in transmission distribution. But one thing that is common among all of us is that we are obviously experiencing unprecedented change among customers, utilities, regulators around the world. And we have this convergence of climate change, decentralization of energy, and technological advancements that are creating challenges and opportunities for all of us across our sector. And navigating these 4 disruptors that we talk about, decarbonization, decentralization, digitalization, and democratization, navigating that will really take a true desire among all stakeholders to push for change in our regulatory systems. And we need to do that with pace. And that's going to take a lot of courage, I think, on all of our parts. It's going to require partnerships and trust and accountability on all levels across all stakeholders. And without that, or a desire for change and the courage to do it, we collectively in our industry, and importantly our customers, run the risk of being left behind.
It's so true what you're saying, Melanie, about the need for change. And I think it's extremely important that you've acknowledged that change is from a regulatory forum perspective. It's also about the pace of addressing and responding to change, and that there's obviously the 4Ds, the 4 disruptors that we're talking about throughout today's session that are impacting our sector. And so when you consider, the new big acronym is ESG, environmental, social, and governance, and net zero targets, which we have never talked about before broadly, and certainly not at a nation or national level. There are both now ESG and net zero targets by 2050, and these targets are gaining significant prominence. So I'm wondering where you see the electricity sector going, perhaps even if we don't go all the way to 2050, even if we just go to 2030, so just about a decade from now, where do you see us heading?
I think it's going to vary across jurisdictions, obviously, because we are sort of in different stages in the journey, depending on where you are. But we do have just broadly changing customer expectations. And that's going to require us as utilities to keep up with those expectations, because at the end of the day, all of us in this industry, we're here for one reason, and that's the customer. That's to provide reliable and affordable energy to our customers, to maintain the quality of life that we have in this country. So the changing customer expectations are upon us. Even at a residential level, customers want home EV charging. They want to put up solar panels. Those things are already here and will only continue to become more prevalent. And so that requires us to have a smarter, more decentralized, more automated grid, particularly on the distribution side. The other big segment of customers, and this is something that we feel, especially in our service territory in Northern Alberta, is that large commercial and industrial segment. In our service territory, a lot of that is oil and gas, but we do have a very large commercial industrial segment. And those customers, like us, have a heightened focus on sustainability and ESG. And they want to pursue things in their business to meet their goals. They're electrifying their fleets, microgrids on their plant sites with renewables and storage, and advanced load management systems on their plant sites, things like that. And the utility and our grid needs to be able to support them and handle what they want to do without sacrificing reliability or affordability for them or for any of our other customers. And all of our customers are doing this all at the same time. And so, our grid needs to change to be able to accommodate that. That's very different from the way it operated in the past. And our regulatory framework needs to accommodate the changes that the utilities need to make. And that's the only way to accommodate the changing needs of our customers, all of our customers. So, we do have to acknowledge that it is the customer that matters at the end of the day. And there's nothing worse than, utilities potentially becoming the barrier to our customers meeting decarbonization goals and meeting their own ESG goals.
And so you're absolutely right. We do this all in aid of customers. At the end of the day, any investments that we make, the regulatory positions that we take, it's all with the interest of the end customer, whether residential or commercial, no matter what size in mind. And regulators feel that exact same way, right? In the context of a monopoly, the purpose of the regulator is almost that fair arbiter and, in defense of or in protection of consumer interests. So given that we're all pulling in the same direction in terms of supporting our customers, what do you think that this means, this time of intense change and, really a vastly moving frontier in terms of environmental and sustainability driven targets? What does that mean for electricity regulation and regulators?
Well, as competition to the grid appears, which is happening, and of course we don't mean competition, there's no second grid in competition, it's different ways for customers to meet their own energy needs. As competition appears and technologies advance, we need to understand the implications on the regulatory compact. And that, that doesn't feel like it's happening tomorrow, but when you look out 10 years, we talked about 2030, 40, 50, does that need to change? Because right now utilities obviously have an obligation to serve, and the regulatory compact is very longstanding and important. But regulation is a proxy for competition. And I don't think there's a utility here today who would say they're not feeling the pressures of competition. And so it does feel like we're on the precipice of that change, that, we're not going to throw away the regulatory compact tomorrow, obviously. But we do need to be mindful of, things like, how fair returns are established in the future, how prudent investments are made under that obligation to serve, and how they continue to be recovered. And it does require flexibility and new thinking from all stakeholders to ensure that the right solutions are implemented, and that new technologies that are good for customers and for the grid and that lower costs, non-wires alternatives, for an example, that those things can be adopted, and that there's a robust framework around how utilities start investing in those things. And these are things that weren't even contemplated as possibilities when our utility regulatory framework was struck through legislation. So, we have to be able to navigate that, and our regulatory systems need to consider that the investments of the future are not the same as the investments of the past. And there has to be a way of sort of a logical framework around letting this transition happen.
You've touched upon the regulator's role and the evolving framework that will need to take hold in order to respond over the next 10 years, 2030. There's an interplay, though, when you consider that the national, decarbonization is in fact a national objective. And so what's the role then, given that electricity is regulated at the provincial level, what do you see as the federal government's role in supporting grid investment, particularly given that, as I said, the decarbonization target is one that has been espoused at a federal level?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, absolutely. The provincial jurisdiction exists for energy and for utility regulation. And we have kind of a patchwork of unique frameworks across the provinces and territories in Canada. We have different market designs. There's investor-owned utilities in some, and crown organizations and others. For example, very different mix of generation. Some provinces have an abundance of clean hydro, and other provinces like Alberta and Saskatchewan, we don't. So there does need to be provincial oversight. It's the right thing to do to have provincial regulatory oversight to ensure that we can accommodate those differences. But federal policy kind of sets the stage for all of it. So the federal government obviously has a very big role to play in the setting of clear policy goals, and they've done that, and they continue to do that for decarbonization goals, for example, and policy implementation. And another important role of the federal government too is how they can de-risk investments made by utilities and others, by some of our customers, through financial support. And I think that's really important, because I think everybody knows that the energy transition has to happen. We have to address climate change. We need to decarbonize our economy. But the economics of that in some places are very challenging. And so there's definitely a role to play through sort of that financial support and de-risking of investments through government and government policy. Once that happens, though, of course, the solution in each province or territory isn't one size fits all, and we need to make sure that we can deliver the right solutions to achieve those decarbonization goals, for example, at the provincial level, with the solution that makes the most sense in that area.
Can you speak to how this plays out specifically at a provincial level, for instance, for your province, like for Alberta in particular? Particularly when we're talking about decarbonization. So it's a different flavor, if you will, across the country on how decarbonization takes hold.
Yeah, for sure it is. I mean, provinces, I already mentioned it, provinces like Alberta, we don't have access to any material amount of hydroelectricity.
Right.
And so we have to have a different approach to meeting decarbonization goals. But what we do have here in Alberta is an abundance of natural gas and associated pipeline and storage infrastructure. I mean, the natural gas network here is extensive. And we also have the right geology for carbon storage in Alberta. So something like a hydrogen economy is likely a faster and more economic way to decarbonize something like space heating in Alberta rather than electrification of space heating. So, electrification in Alberta is going to look different than it is in Manitoba or Ontario or Quebec. And that's okay. That's just something we have to recognize and be able to deal with. But what it means is that the electric utilities in Alberta are likely to be not as impacted by electrification in the same way. Our regulatory systems need to consider that. I mean, I think we all think that electrification of transportation will happen. We have all the major automakers have declared that they're not going to make the internal combustion engine after certain dates. So we know that is going to happen. But space heating is maybe a different solution here. And we also have in Alberta a fairly heavy reliance on the oil and gas industry in our province, economically, as well as our electric grid. Much of our electric grid was built to serve that industry. And so we need to consider that over time, as decarbonization happens and other businesses and companies and sectors in the economy are transitioning to net zero, there will be a drop in demand from the oil and gas sector on the electricity grid. And so that raises all kinds of questions on investments in transmission assets to serve that industry, in distribution assets. Echo Electric has thousands and thousands of kilometers of distribution line on Crown land that serves the oil and gas industry, and we acknowledge that is not going to be there forever. So there's some big considerations for utilities that are jurisdiction specific. I'm talking about Alberta and our oil and gas customers, which obviously many places in the country don't have that situation. They have something completely different, but it's just really important that we all have the same goal.
Yes.
Of decarbonization, and we're going to get there in different ways. And policymakers and regulators need to be able to accommodate that wherever they are.
I want to pick up, thank you for that. I want to pick up on one of the themes that you just spoke about, and you were talking about the both distribution and transmission investments. And so if I can ask you to speak to that for just a moment, with what are the special considerations? And this is an audience question I should identify. I'm going to flip back and forth. There are a few audience questions coming in for you, Melanie. So what are the special considerations for remote and Indigenous communities when it comes to the kinds of future-oriented investments that you were just speaking to?
Great question. There are, and we're a utility. We're in the Northwest Territories in the Yukon and Northern Alberta, so we have a lot of remote and Indigenous communities that we serve. But there are some 250 remote communities in Canada, and 70% of them use diesel generators to produce electricity. They are not grid connected to the main interconnected grids in the provinces and territories. And each one of those communities is different, and we need to continue to find ways to partner with them to help them provide renewable solutions. Maybe top of mind for me, we just recently completed Canada's largest off-grid solar project, and there's a very remote community in Northern Alberta called Fort Chipewyan, and we're providing them with clean energy and reducing their use of diesel fuel by 800,000 liters a year. And it's top of mind for me because just last night, we were awarded with the prestigious Emerald Award for our environmental and social stewardship on that project. But what it is we designed and built 2 solar farms in partnership with the Athabasca Chipewyan First Nation, the Mikisew Cree First Nation, and the Fort Chipewyan Métis Association. The larger of the 2 solar farms, the 2.2 megawatt farm, is owned by those 3 Indigenous communities. And then we own the smaller one, the 600 kilowatt farm, and we also own the battery energy storage system and the microgrid controller. So it's wonderful new technology in a very small, remote Indigenous community. And projects like that just provide clear examples to how industry and Indigenous communities can work together for the greater good. It was truly win-win. So not only do we reduce emissions in a very remote community, but we also took a very big step in the support of real business reconciliation, providing an opportunity for economic participation of the Indigenous people there in business and in the energy supply for their own community. They own those assets. They make money on power generation there. So there are different ownership and operating models that can be used to advance these future investments in these rural and remote communities to serve our greater goals around climate change and reconciliation at the same time. And this has never been more important. Francis opened with his acknowledgement of the discovery in Kamloops. It's shocking, it's horrifying, it's devastating. And it's a part of Canadian history that we must know about, and we must talk about, and we must reconcile. And I really believe that as business leaders in our industry, we have an urgent responsibility for business reconciliation, and we can do that through real, commercially sound business partnerships and arrangements, like the one that we have in Fort Chipewyan.
That is a fantastic example of, pardon the expression, but you're putting your money where your mouth is. We're not just doing the land acknowledgements because it's the right thing to do. It's about empowerment. It's about partnership. And you're demonstrating that with the real examples that are occurring through your organization. The award is, it's the icing on the cake, if you will, but doing the right thing is really what's fundamental here. So thank you for sharing that. It's an amazing example. I'm going to go up to one final audience question, if I may, because we're just about out of time. It's amazing how quickly time flies. Mm-hmm. I will say, in your opinion, how do you see the regulator and utilities innovating and adapting to today's needs without significantly impacting rates?
I think that the need to innovate and adapt to needs is the thing that will keep us from significantly impacting rates. So if we don't do it, if we don't modernize our grids, adopt technology, change our business models, change the service we deliver, and continue to have large traditional investments in poles and wires, I think that will have a bigger impact on rates than modernization will. So instead of building up big electric utility systems to manage any combination of events on the grid, we should be investing in making our grids smarter to be able to automate changes on our grid as those events happen. And I really think that seems, something like grid modernization seems like, this is a big investment. It's, we're leaping off a cliff, assuming that this energy transition is going to happen. That might all be true, but if we don't do it, I think the consequences are much, much bigger. Because I think it would, like I said, automakers have declared they're not going to make internal combustion engines. We need to assume that everyone has an electric vehicle by 2050.
There's the weight cost to doing that.
There is a weight cost. So affordability is critically important. Operating a rural distribution utility with higher rates than urban utilities, we know this. We hear our customers around the affordability question all the time. But I really think that innovating and modernizing our grids and adopting technology is the way to manage affordability and rates for customers, and that the wait and see approach will be more costly in the long run.
I couldn't agree with you more. Waiting and seeing, it's a near term, it's a myopic view, and trying to manage to the cost today while potentially severely impacting the costs in the future. Melanie, our 30 minutes has flown by. I want to thank you so much for the opportunity to sit, not quite so fireside, but to have an intimate fireside discussion amongst 600 of our closest friends. I hope that all of you have enjoyed the discussion, and please do keep the questions in the chat coming for the upcoming panels. It's worked very effectively, so thank you for that. And as I wrap up this first session and introduce the next, I'd like to thank Francis and Justin Cruson. Justin from the CEA has supported the ERIC committee, the Economic Regulation and Innovation Committee, for almost my entire tenure as chair. He's made my work effortless, or at least been such a solid partner that it was always fun to be doing it. So as I end my term as chair, I want to thank everyone on the committee as well as the CEA. And with that, I'd like to introduce the next panel. Our next panel will talk about perspectives on the 4Ds of disruption, and I will hand over to our moderator, Curtis Hildebrandt, Director of Regulatory Affairs from NMAX, for our next session. Thank you so much. Thank you, Melanie.
Thank you, Indy.
Thank you, Indy. Good afternoon. The first panel today will discuss different perspectives on the challenges facing both the electricity sector and the current regulatory frameworks. I'd like to thank Siemens for sponsoring the panel. As a reminder, to access the Q&A and to participate in polling, please feel free to click on the Slido icon in the top right corner of your webcast screen. Alternatively, if you'd like to access from your mobile device, navigate to slido.com in your chosen browser and enter the hashtag CEA Regulatory Forum 2021, all one word, to participate. We'll begin with some short opening remarks followed by the Q&A session, so please keep the questions coming. And I believe that the opening remarks will be kicked off by Jennifer Nicholson from the Nova Scotia Utility and Review Board. It appears we might have lost Jennifer, so how about Richard Carlson? Can you begin the opening remarks?
Sure, I can begin. I can start things off here. Thank you very much for having me on this panel. It's great to be here with this great list of speakers. My name is Richard Carlson, and I'm with Pollution Probe, which is the oldest environmental organization in Canada. And I'm talking to you today from Toronto, which for thousands of years has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the credit. And it is an honor to be living in a place that has had such a long history and is still the home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island. Pollution Probe and our partner Quest, another Canadian NGO, has spent the last couple of years looking into clean energy innovation and regulatory modernization with our ongoing project to help develop innovation sandboxes across Canada. In short, what we learned is that our current regulatory system is not fit for the energy system that has those 4 Ds in the title of the panel today. Our current regulatory system will not allow us to introduce the innovation we need in the time frame we need, and will not allow us to adequately evaluate the trade-offs and include equity considerations. And it's not just us saying this. Pollution Probe and Quest heard this in 2019 when we surveyed utilities, regulators, and policymakers across Canada. We heard it again in an online poll, actually, at this year's CAMPUT conference, where 54% said Canadian regulators are poorly or very poorly positioned for the energy future. I think only 1% said they're well positioned. And these are the people who should know. We're also hearing the same thing in our international work with ISCAN, so it's not just in Canada. ISCAN is one of the IEA's technology collaboration programs in smart grids and regulatory modernization. First, it will need innovation to meet our net zero targets. But the innovation we need is not just in fancy new gadgets. And as the IEA pointed out a few weeks ago, most of the tech we need to meet our targets, we either have now or we know of. Of course, work still does need to be done on them. But the real innovation we need is on business models, on rate structures, compensation structures, cost allocation, et cetera, which in my opinion is the real sexy stuff. And this innovation has to start now. We can't wait to see what happened or what different utilities propose. At the same time, getting to net zero requires massive infrastructure expansion. This was brought up by the previous speaker, Melanie. The previous speaker brought it up very well. And this expansion will include smart transmission and distribution grids investment, and this will be at a scale that we've not seen in decades. The 20th century regulatory system is simply not up to the challenges of the scope and scale of this transition. The problem that current regulatory frameworks are designed for are no longer the central problem. Old school financial incentives, such as those embedded in rate of return regulation, and even incentive regulation to a large degree, will not be the right tool for this job. Also, this transition will require engagement and collaboration from sectors and communities, yet the energy sector is not used to dealing with. The energy sector, and I include regulators here as well as utilities, tend to have a paternalistic attitude. We know best, so don't worry about it and don't argue with us attitude. You hear that a lot when you talk to communities across Canada. And for this transition to be equitable, communities have to be brought in and included. And this is even more critical when we're dealing with Indigenous communities and the need to include them in this energy transition. So what do we need to do? First, we need to clearly define the problem. How do we accelerate the deployment of low carbon business practices and infrastructure to get us to a net zero future? And how do we do so in an equitable manner at the lowest cost possible and in a way that includes everybody? Based on the work that Pollution Probe and Quest are doing, we see innovation sandboxes as a key method to quickly test innovation and new regulatory practices, while also ensuring that what continues to work is protected. Transitions don't go away if you ignore them. Ignoring them just leads to more uncertainty and higher costs down the road, and that was again brought up by the previous speaker. A safe transition is the planned transition, and an equitable transition is a planned transition. So we need to start planning our transition now. Thank you.
Thanks, Richard. It appears that Jennifer Nicholson is back. You've returned.
I'm back.
Excellent. Can you please provide your opening remarks?
Thanks so much to the CEA for the opportunity to speak at this important event today. First of all, I want to say that I'm coming to you from Mi'kma'ki, the ancestral and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq people here in beautiful Nova Scotia. And unlike Indy, who did not have a fake background, I do, of the iconic Peggy's Cove Lighthouse that many of you would have seen or certainly would know about. And I should also mention that my comments today are mine alone and not necessarily reflective of the UARB. Many of you may have the view that regulators are a barrier
It looks like we're having some more internet problems. So, Sally, I'm hoping that your connection is a little bit better. Can you provide your remarks, please?
Sure. Thank you, Curtis. And thanks to the CEA for this invitation to join you and to all the panelists. It's just a pleasure to be here. My name is Sally Talberg. I've spent the last 25 years working in energy regulation, mostly in government, but also in the private sector. I'm a former state utility regulator and served on the Michigan Public Service Commission from 2013 until last year. I started my own consulting firm called Talberg Policy Solutions earlier this year and worked with clients on regulatory strategy focused on clean energy. So before we get into the Q&A, I just wanted to share my perspective on the 4Ds, which I believe are driving transformational, unprecedented change in the energy industry. First, decarbonization policies are, it's not just governments, but many corporations are sending strong market signals just for clean energy innovation and investment. Exxon, Mobil, Shell are just two recent examples of that, with actions by governments or boards. The Biden administration policies, finally, the Michigan or the U.S. Is following actions by other countries, including Canada, to take more aggressive steps to mitigate climate change. Customers are a huge part of this. When you think about democratization and how that fits in, they're expressing a preference for cleaner energy, more control, greater reliability. One example is corporate purchasing of renewable energy. This has been a huge push across the nation and the world, where corporations are demanding and developing their own renewable energy to meet their ESG goals. Another example, and this is more top down, but at a policy level that could lead to significant changes in terms of customer participation and distributed resources, is the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission's Order 2222. It allows third parties to aggregate distributed resources, whether it's electric vehicles, microgrid, storage, PV, and sell that into the wholesale market, whether it's energy, capacity, or ancillary services, and receive payment for value that may not be captured under the current structure today. And so I think this, could really fundamentally, depending on where prices go with technology and market prices, really fundamentally alter the business model for regulated utilities in the U.S. and perhaps be a model for elsewhere. The last two, digitalization, and decentralization, are really about technology and its interface with the customer and the grid, and distributed resources, whether EVs, microgrid, storage. I mean, they're enabling solutions on the grid itself, but also the customer side of the meter. And it just seems like, from my perspective, I can't think of a time where maybe going back to the 90s with the shift towards retail electric competition, where you're seeing this kind of momentum and transformational changes. But I think this could even be more profound in terms of really altering how energy is produced and used. My work as a utility regulator, we focused a ton on infrastructure modernization, dealing with an aging fleet of power plants, transitioning from coal to renewables and energy efficiency, installing new high voltage transmission to strengthen connections, upgrading a 100-year-old electric distribution system. But if you think about those concepts that were underlying utility planning, service delivery, rate making, energy efficiency program, really dated to like the 80s, even the 1970s. And I think what we're seeing now, just in the last couple of years in particular, was just more potential disruption that are driven by these 4Ds. And I think it's going to require a lot of rethinking of market design, operations, and planning to continue to provide safe, reliable, affordable service. We can talk a little bit more about an initiative we launched in Michigan to help prepare for this, the transition to clean, renewable, distributed resources. It's called My Power Grid. I'm just happy to share perspective on the philosophy from a regulatory, U.S. regulators' perspective. But one last point I wanted to make that's relevant to my background, and if you Googled my name and to this topic with the change we're seeing in the industry, I served as the chair of the Electric Reliability Council of Texas board for 5 days when the February cold weather event hit. And it resulted in over 4 million residents losing power for multiple days and the loss of half of the region's electricity generation during extreme weather conditions. I ended up resigning shortly thereafter with other board members. There were political concerns over not being Texas residents. But I bring that up because while those 13 days may have seemed short of board service, I think they felt like eternity for Texans that were out of power, water, food, gas, and other supplies. There were individuals who lost loved ones to hypothermia, carbon monoxide poisoning. I mean, truly a catastrophic situation. And this only renewed my passion for improving the resilience of our critical infrastructure systems to prepare for extreme weather that we see happening more often and more severely. And so as this electric system and energy system is shifting, I think distributed resources provide some resilient solutions, but they also can increase some interdependencies that we need to be mindful of. And so just wanted to share that perspective as well as we get started in our discussion today. Again, thanks for having me.
Thanks, Sally. Peter, can you please provide your opening remarks?
Yes, thank you. My name is Peter Helland, and I'm the director of the Residential Consumer Intervenor Association, joining from the traditional and unceded territory of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh First Nations in British Columbia. I'm also a principal at Midgard Consulting, and in that role, I have worked on regulatory files in the majority of provinces and territories across Canada. And perhaps more importantly, or more relevantly, I've worked for all sides of the table, on behalf of regulators, on behalf of utilities, and on behalf of interveners. So just an introductory comment, it always amazes me how compelling and interesting the issues surrounding a commodity, 60 hertz alternating current electricity, is and have remained since basically this commodity has been in place since the since the late 1800s, but the issues surrounding it are remain compelling and interesting. As will be no surprise to you, this being CAMPUT, boards across Canada have similar mandates that run along the lines of ensuring rates are fair and just, services adequate and non-discriminatory, and balance is achieved between the needs of both utilities and ratepayers. So you might be asking yourself, well, Peter, why are you telling me this? I already know that. And the answer is, boards manage a process within which government sets policy, utilities are monopoly asset managers, ratepayers pay the bills, and boards evaluate the trade-offs primarily between three factors. And it's these three factors that I'll focus on and are important to me: cost, system reliability or service, and risk. And I'll argue that historically these trade-offs have been muted, and muted for good reason, because over the last century, North America has seen widespread and sustained electrical growth, and economic options were considered socially acceptable. But we've entered a new era, an era with uneven electricity growth, aging infrastructure, and infrastructure demographics. The traditional economic options are no longer seen politically and socially as being acceptable. And we're seeing increasing real dollar electricity prices. Issues of energy poverty and social equity pressures are increasing. So the reason I bring this up is relatively simple, not easy, but simple. Yes, we need regulatory innovation and technological innovation, but, and it's an important but, this needed innovation and change needs to be founded on a genuine trade-off between cost, reliability, and risk to be sustainable over the long term and to preserve fairness and adequacy for both utilities and ratepayers. So I'll just provide some examples. I've said a lot of stuff and it sounds a little bit philosophic, but let's sort of drive it home with a couple examples associated with EVs or distributed generation, two topics that are, top of mind and top of conversation today. Fairness. The simple question is, who is left with the bill as targeted policies are scaled up and broadly adopted? This is a key question. It's when volumes are small, it doesn't really matter because it's not that impactful. But as the policies are scaled up and broadly adopted, this becomes key. Rate design. Across Canada and North America, I'm sure, residential rates are predominantly designed around energy. But given the innovations on the horizon, rate redesign is required to fairly value capacity, a topic and a feature of the electricity grid that few understand well and few can explain well to lay audiences. But there needs to be a shift from this predominantly energy focus to one that balances both energy and capacity. Reliability. Reliability does not need to be ever improving. And it should be argued, at least before boards in a disciplined and rationed way, that it's possible that reliability should be reduced if rates are reduced sufficiently to offset the reduction in reliability. And I put that out there more just to be provocative than because I believe we should reduce reliability, but it's a conversation worth having in certain cases. Risk. Modern asset management practices enabled by big data are here. They're accessible, they're achievable by all utilities. And that information is transferable or demonstratable to ratepayers. And we believe quite firmly that with modern asset management practices, more can be extracted from the existing asset base for the purposes of relieving some cost pressures so that there's space opened up to essentially finance and pay for innovation. And then finally, as we've discussed, there needs to be other members have discussed of this panel, there needs to be a reevaluation of what are natural monopolies that need to be regulated. Transmission and distribution are natural monopolies, no argument there. But speaking to electric vehicles or distributed generation, is the actual point of interconnection a natural monopoly? For example, free electricity at EV charging stations. Maybe we should reconsider some of the existing business models. And so what you get is a very complex discussion around, relatively, I don't want to say simple topics, but, straightforward topics like electric vehicles or distributed generation. They're constrained topics, but they have wide-ranging conversations. And just in closing, what I really want to say is it's only through a genuine conversation about the trade-offs between cost, reliability, and risk before our boards, which is a much more rational and reasoned place for conversation, that a sustainable space will be opened up to enable our desired future. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Peter. Jennifer, can you hear us? I think you might be on mute. Okay, I think we'll have to come back to Jennifer, but we can begin our question and answer. Try one more time, Jennifer.
Okay, so everyone, I'm not sure why. Apparently I need a new computer. It keeps kicking me out, and the phone numbers don't work either, so I apologize. I will continue from where I was, where I think that we are actually facilitators of all the change. Utilities generally produce and deliver power, and governments make policy. But as regulators, we engage utilities, customers, and other interested stakeholders to ensure that customers receive safe, reliable energy at a just and reasonable price. We also recognize that utility shareholders must have the opportunity to earn a fair return on their investments. We believe that we bring process to the table, and we do our best to ensure that those processes are open, transparent, respectful, and as inclusive as possible. We have a big picture focus, and we work to ensure that everyone is heard and all issues are canvassed. And when we make decisions, they're timely, well-reasoned, and easily understood. there's big changes coming, as we've heard about already, and they're coming fast. I think they're coming faster than any of us anticipated, with the reductions in emissions, the impact of renewables, and the penetration of distributed energy resources. Change is coming faster than ever. For decades, there's been warnings about climate change, but it's quite well acknowledged that there is no more time to wait. For governments, utilities, and regulators, 2030, and indeed 2050 is really just around the corner. And the public increasingly demands accountability and transparency on these issues. They want to be involved and they want to have their say. What is at stake here for regulators is our credibility. These issues have attracted significant social momentum. Expectations are very high, and public policy is starting to reflect that at an increasing rate. And finally, regulators are going to see these issues reflected in more proceedings related to rate design and cost allocation, particularly as technologies evolve and there's greater access to data. And that's it for me right now. Hopefully I'm still here.
No, you're absolutely still here. Thank you so much.
Great.
It was perfect. During COVID, we've learned how to overcome some of these obstacles, and I think we've succeeded here.
Oh, I know. I mean, you just never know what's going to happen, right? It's playing it by ear.
That's true. All right, now we can move to the Q&A session, and I'd encourage audience members, please, to put questions up, but we've got one question to start. And that's one of the challenges of decarbonizing the power sector is sufficiently reducing greenhouse gas emissions while balancing other objectives, such as reliability, security, and affordability. What should regulators do to best achieve this balance?
So I think we're going to start with me on this one. And I will reiterate, as an economic regulator, we certainly have to ensure that all measures undertaken by the utility are done so in a way to minimize the rate impact on customers, and also to allow the utility to recover, of course, its prudently incurred costs. But there's a few things that are happening, and we've certainly talked about that already. Melanie referred to it in her fireside chat earlier. First of all, certainly here in Nova Scotia, integrated resource planning is playing a big part in what's going to happen in the future. Nova Scotia Power, who is our vertically integrated monopoly utility in Nova Scotia, just completed their IRP, which modeled various scenarios to determine the lowest cost energy strategy over 25 years. And it will take us to 2045, considering all the clean energy targets and many different options. Through this process, Nova Scotia Power engaged many different stakeholders. It allowed extensive stakeholder input, and most importantly, it took account of that feedback and made very valuable changes to the final report. And this really speaks to the accountability and the transparency that I referred to in my opening comments. We also have to have a broader view of what is going on in the electricity system as it reacts to developing public policy. So for us in the Maritimes, the East Coast, we have the Maritime Link between Nova Scotia and Newfoundland. It came into service in January 2018, but we're expecting that energy will flow through that link by the end of this year. And we also have a bigger regional strategy with the Atlantic Loop, which is looking at transmission in a bigger realm through the East Coast of Canada. And finally, we are doing things as a regulator with innovation. Last year, we approved an application by Nova Scotia Power for a smart grid pilot project to look at the impact of these newer technologies, PV solar, battery storage, and electric vehicle charging stations on the grid. This was partially 2/3 supported by the federal government. So therefore, it fit with our innovation criteria, and we were able to approve that project. So I think a lot of innovation, a lot of creativity, and a lot of communication is required to make the changes as we go forward. Back to you, Curtis.
Does anyone else want to respond to that question? Richard.
To a certain extent, I kind of feel it's been unfair that all this balancing has been put on the regulator. A lot of this is is we do need political leadership to kind of give long-term policy direction. We kind of have it federally, but even there, it's spotchy. Most provinces, I would argue, do not have strong policy leadership and strong policy direction. It's a lot of this has to be given to the political leadership to tell the regulator, okay, do this, and then that can then be included in how they consider their decisions. Saying that, I think regulators do have a public obligation to be prepared for what's coming. So as Jennifer mentioned, it is something that they need to be concerned about and need to be kept up to date as going on. And they need to think about, when you're looking at consumers and costs, it's also, you have to consider other long-term equity issues, such as the social cost of carbon. What kind of discount rates are they using when discussing whether or not something is going to be cost effective in the future? And I have argued in the past that discount rates will be central to any conversation on the future of a transition. So I think we need to, and also what is the cost of capital going to be if there's going to be divestment, and maybe it's going to be harder to raise capital on the bond market. So all these have to come together and be considered by the regulator. And they also think about what they can do. A lot of this I can't say it either. Digitalization is, I think, what privacy, how does this deal with privacy? And do energy regulators have the capacity to deal with privacy issues? Maybe that's better dealt with by another regulator who's more of a targeted responsibility.
Curtis, I'll chime in. Just a couple thoughts in terms of regulators and the balancing act that they play. I mean, my perspective as a former regulator is that if you're able to, there's many litigated proceedings and, contested cases, matters that go, to the highest level of courts, and disputes that have to be addressed through those means. But there are opportunities, and I think regulators can play a key role in convening, having an inclusive process to work through a lot of these issues and being able to anticipate and respond to changes that are happening in the industry. And I think, a more traditional approach where it's much more reactive, I just don't see that working well with the pace of change that we're facing. And, another couple of roles, one is, Richard pointed out that the political leadership, and I think regulators can really play a role, not necessarily advocating for policy change, but actually helping to inform policymakers as they formulate and try and address some of these issues and provide direction to regulators. And then lastly, I always had the philosophy of providing certainty. Like, that was part of my job, issuing timely decisions. You have the information that's available through that process, and you make the best decision you can. There will be unanticipated consequences. There will be changing conditions, and you may have to revisit. But I think it's really important for both regulated entities and other customers and market participants to have decisions so that they can move forward with their business plans.
Thank you very much. We've got some audience questions now, and some of them appear to be quite difficult. The first one, utility risk-taking was a topic at CAMPUT. Do you think utilities should be incentivized to undertake R&V and other non-traditional services? Is there anyone on the panel willing to take that one? Aha, Richard, go ahead.
As a non-regulator here, I probably have I'm not participating in a lot of these, so I have a bit more freedom to talk about it. Not incentivized, but not disincentivized. In certain aspects, they should be forced to consider a lot of like non-wire solutions and DER options, and making sure that if they do go for non-wire solutions, that they're not penalized, because as opposed to the traditional capital infrastructure they would have done. I don't know if I'm not sure if having if you're looking at incentive mechanism, incentive rate setting, that there's they get a bonus if they use non-wire solutions. They should just be told that is a consideration that they have to do.
All right, the next question from the audience. In your opinion, How do you see the regulator and the utility innovate and adapt to today's needs without significantly impacting rates? Again, this is another tough one. Peter.
I tend to think that without utilities being, I'll say, encouraged, forced, asked, demanded of to extract more from their existing asset base, there won't be enough cost relief with the existing asset base to be able to do that without significant increases in cost. So once again, going back to my opening statement, modern asset management approaches, moving from the very subjective, risk-adverse approaches that utilities often adopt. And let's be clear, utilities are in a difficult situation in that they're punished asymmetrically when risks materialize. They can engage in good engineering, they can engage in good decision, but when something goes wrong, they're judged in a court of public opinion and often unfairly. And as a result, I believe that this asymmetry has resulted in a risk-adverse culture, or at least facilitated a risk-adverse culture that makes it difficult for them to engage in the necessary innovations. So without extracting more from the existing assets, there won't be room for all the innovation. There's large segments of our society that are struggling with energy poverty today, that are, struggling to pay their bills, and to ask them to take on even more when there are other avenues that haven't yet been fully exhausted, I'm not sure is fair.
This came up in, I think, one of the questions that Melanie, the keynote speaker, addressed in terms of the cost impacts and impacts on rates. And I tend to agree with her conclusion that modernizing the system, we really have no choice, and that the status quo could actually be far more costly. And maintaining aging equipment can be expensive. Being able to withstand extreme weather events and other conditions. And the trick there is trying to figure out how to have cost-effective investments that are going to be, with such a dynamic environment, are going to be there for the long haul. But that's where advancements in planning models, getting out of just looking at a traditional resource type plan with an integrated resource plan, and being more integrated with distribution system planning, so that regulators can look more holistically at different alternatives and solutions under different scenario sets. So I prescribe by the philosophy that being able to capture some of the operational and even in some cases capital savings from making upgrades can be far better than a reactive approach that can end up still costing customers and causing other problems on the system.
I think I agree with Sally, and that innovation is going to happen regardless. We don't have a choice. The rules are changing. We can't go with the old status quo. It's not an option. So innovation has to be, we have to figure out how to make it work. So looking at sharing both the risk and the upside of the innovation with ratepayers and utilities, and certainly, as we talked about earlier, there'll be some incentives from the federal level to help make these investments so that we can transition to the cleaner state that we need to be in.
Panel, I've got a question for you, Richard, and I'm not sure I understand it, so let's do our best between the two of us. It says, related to innovation sandboxes, how do they overcome a paternalistic attitude, and how do they focus on new services and business models? I think they mean the regulator, by they maybe?
Yeah, probably.
Give it a shot?
Yeah, one of the key components of innovation sandbox is bringing everyone around the table to talk. I try not to smirk too much, and regulators say they have a very inclusive process, because it's very inclusive if you're a lawyer. And if you follow, I mean, I spend a lot of time following regulatory proceedings, and I've done so for a long time. I'm not a lawyer, and I get confused and lost. Regulatory proceedings are great, but they are very, very complex. They're not always the best way to actually be inclusive and bring collaboration around. They do have their place, don't get me wrong, and there's a reason for a lot of that complexity, but it's not a very welcoming environment. So in innovation, if you're going to be looking at innovation, we need to how do you bring in new entrants? How do you bring in people new communities, new entrants, and allow them to participate? And a lot of innovation sandboxes consists around collaboration and co-developing models and co-developing what it means, what you're trying to develop, where you're trying to go, and what kind of innovation you need in order to get there. So that allows for a lot more of that collaboration can be very difficult that can be very difficult to do in a regulatory process.
Thank you. The next question I think is for you, Sally. Utilities, governments, and other stakeholders are taking a longer and deeper look at building system resilience to limit and mitigate the risks to customers of extreme weather events, wildfires, and equipment failures, etc. How can utilities leverage distributed energy resources to improve system / customer resilience?
Thanks, Curtis. A couple of thoughts. I mean, so first of all, I think there's tremendous opportunity with distributed resources, although, being able to have systems that are coordinating controls and other communications to really get the maximum benefit, I think there's still a lot of work to be done. But just a couple of examples. There's been studies on home energy efficiency and the difference under extreme cold or heat, the time where it's basically livable temperatures, and it's remarkably different depending on how well that home is insulated. And we know that's, based on our experience in Michigan running those types of programs, it's far more cost effective than even buying the fossil fuels to be burning into, existing power plants. So that's one example where efficiency. Demand response is an old tool. It's been used often like with interruptible rates with industrial customers to get discounts, but with technology, there's so many capabilities and sophisticated players that can aggregate, smaller load reductions and make a big impact in terms of system conditions. And the one thing there that I think has been a challenge is a lot of those were geared around a summer peak. You get those 3-4 days, and maybe in Canada it's more of a winter peak. But I think looking at being able to have more responsive demand under different system conditions, regardless of what time of year it is really important in terms of the evolution of those types of efforts. On-site generation, battery storage, electric vehicles. I'm a proud Michigander with the Ford Lightning that was announced, and just the capability to be able to have backup supplies for your home for electricity for 3 days or even more if you're kind of constraining on what uses you use. That was a partnership with Sunrun, which is really interesting, a major retailer of solar and battery systems. And so it seems again like the opportunities are very significant. And I didn't even really touch on microgrids. I think, there are some models out there and technologies with microgrids that are much more plug and play, I would say, and could be used to assist organizations that can help provide essential services, whether it's warming or cooling centers or for water treatment. Again, I think, we may see more large cities and other communities investing in these to be able to withstand, different system conditions that could compromise electricity, water, other critical services.
Thank you very much. We've got another question I think maybe Peter will want to start answering, but probably other people on the panel will have an interest in answering as well. But it's all customers, whether or not they are interested in adopting distributed energy resources, will be affected by grid modernization. What should be done to ensure that customers understand the costs and benefits from the coming changes in the electric industry?
Yeah, so that's a simple question, very complex answer. Sort of boiling that down, people can accept and adapt to new technologies. People are good at that. Where the angst comes, where the difficulty comes, is when you're asking them to make behavioral changes or you're asking them to make pocketbook changes. And it's the behavioral changes that are very difficult for people because it disrupts the patterns of their life that they've grown into, that they like and enjoy. So when we look at the adoption of new technologies, it's not the technology per se that's difficult. It's the way it impacts a person's behaviors through a day that are challenging and uncomfortable. So when we look at that, I'll argue that the technologies that will be most successful and will require the least road paving before they become accepted are those that have the least impact on behavior. But those that do have a significant impact on behavior are going to be harder. And one of the, a couple examples would be, an EV. We're all used to paying for parking. Currently in BC, you plug in your EV and you get free electricity along with your parking. Question is, okay, if everybody does that, is that really sustainable? So that might be one where the electricity is an adder to the parking and the behavior is not changed, that you could see that working. Other things become more difficult. Introducing the idea of capacity into a residential ratepayer's bill, and however you choose to do that. We've grown so accustomed to energy being the same price throughout the day or through most of the day. I know in Ontario there's some time of day pricing, but the change in behavior that drives is more difficult, more challenging, and it's never been part of the conversation to date. So those ones will be much more difficult. Those changes that are necessary, where you have these fundamental cognitive shifts for people. So I'll stop there. But basically, it's the ones that drive behavioral change that will be the challenge.
All right, we have an audience question, and I think it might be for Peter, but I'm not sure. It said, when you say risk to whom? Are you expecting utilities to hold all the risk? If that is the case, shouldn't they also be allowed to reap the greater rewards?
So risk and risk allocation is a complex issue. We're not going to solve it all here today. But let's be clear who pays the bills. Ratepayers pay the bills. So they do bear a great deal of the risk regardless. I've sat on filings where I've seen transmission lines go from $90 million to over $200 million because the utility chose an inappropriate strategy. The ratepayer bore the risk because utilities get paid on actuals. Understood. There are other risks that the utility should bear. Execution risk, things that are wholly within the control of the utility to be good and effective at. So those are risks that the utility should bear. The risks for things that are sort of exogenous to the utility, outside the utility's control, those are more complicated and should be shared. So in answer to your question, some risks utilities should bear because they're wholly within their control. Some risks are shared, and some risks are borne by ratepayers. And really, it's the board's job, and it's their unenviable or their difficult job to allocate those risks accordingly.
Go ahead, Richard.
I mean, at the moment, I would argue that most utilities do not have a lot of risk. We've not, at least in Canada, possibly elsewhere. There's very little downside to a lot of what utility decisions, as long as they have as long as they have regulator approval. So if there is going to be more if utilities are going to want more for being innovative, then they're going to have to make sure that they also take on greater risks. And I don't think there is a political willingness for utilities to fail. So then you have to wonder, how do you play that risk reward basis when there's no chance that you can fail? Or if you fail, you just take a bit of a, oh, well, we rate base it and off we go. So how do you allow that? If you don't allow some risk, you're not going to really get the innovation, but we can't really allow risk because the utility is almost too big to fail. So that's going to be a very difficult assessment we're going to have to make as to how do we share the risk and reward that Peter's been talking about when the risk is very low on the utility side.
Thanks very much. Our time flew by, and we're at the end of the panel. So I'd like to thank you so much for participating today. And I think right now we're going to take a 10-minute break, and I look forward to hearing panel number 2. Take care. Thank you.
Thank you.
Electricity is changing the way we connect with the world. From virtual conferences to the cars on our streets, it's a powerful value in our lives each and every day. Domino High Voltage Supply is Canada's only coast-to-coast stocking distributor for everything your business needs to get the job done in the medium and high voltage sectors. Whether you need dielectric testing, tool rentals or repairs, material management or quality control checks, we have a division that can service and support your projects. Our global reach means we can source or manufacture specialty items specifically tailored to your needs. The future of energy is electric. It is a future that is evolving rapidly, and we're here to supply, support, and service it. We're ready. Are you?
Welcome back, folks. I'm now pleased to introduce our next speaker, all the way from Newfoundland, Minister Seamus O'Regan. Minister O'Regan was appointed Minister of Natural Resources in 2019 with a mandate to put Canada's natural resource sectors at the forefront of the fight against climate change. This mandate includes planting 2 billion trees over 10 years, developing low and zero emission fuels for widespread adoption, and retrofitting homes and infrastructure to ensure peak energy efficiency. The minister is here to share an important update on an initiative affecting our sector. Minister O'Regan.
Hi, Francis. Hi, everyone. I am joining you from the island of Newfoundland, the ancestral homeland of the Mi'kmaq and Beothuk peoples. And let me begin by thanking the CEA for organizing this fantastic forum and for the outstanding work that you and your members do every day on the little things like powering the Canadian economy, keeping all our lights on, making sure Canadians can lead prosperous and comfortable lives, little things. Most Canadians don't often think about electricity, and that's a testament to your work. They don't have to think about it. It's just there at the flick of a switch. Mais votre association fait aussi quelque chose auquel les Canadiens pensent souvent. Vous luttez contre le changement climatique. Vous savez mieux que quiconque que le système électrique est en train de changer grâce aux innovations en matière d'énergie renouvelable, d'énergie distribuée et de stockage de l'énergie. These innovations are captured in your 4Ds: decarbonization, digitization, decentralization, democratization. Each of these critical to a clean, reliable grid. Canada has immense energy resources, far more than most countries. Our wealth in natural resources is the envy of the world. Nature has been very good to us. So let's build a grid worthy of those resources. Notre gouvernement investit dans la modernisation du réseau. Nous savons déjà que l'énergie renouvelable est propre et abordable. Alors prouvons qu'elle est fiable aussi. Rendons-la accessible à tout le monde. Notre gouvernement y travaille déjà. Beaucoup d'entre vous connaissent déjà nos programmes des réseaux intelligents et des énergies renouvelables émergentes. Ces deux programmes ont déjà suscité beaucoup d'intérêt. Il est donc temps d'aller plus loin. So let's do more. Today I'm announcing a new initiative, one that builds on existing programs while also breaking new ground, and one that will support provinces and territories as they incorporate the 4Ds into their grids. It's the Smart Renewables and Electrification Pathways Program. Bit of a mouthful, so I call it SREPS. It will provide $964 million over 4 years for smart renewables and grid modernization. Specifically, it aims to decrease greenhouse gas emissions from our electricity system, increase renewables on the grid, increase reliability and resiliency, and improve the data that we get from the grid, helping analysts and researchers do their jobs. There are 4 streams: established renewables, emerging technologies, grid modernization, and soon, capacity building. Climate change remains the defining challenge of our generation, and the urgency is only going to intensify as we put COVID-19 in our rearview mirror. But it is also the opportunity of a lifetime, and this is the moment to seize it. We won't just rebuild, we will build back better, smarter, more sustainably, more inclusively. This program is a part of that. It's designed to decrease barriers to participation for those underrepresented in the energy sector, including women, gender-diverse peoples, racialized communities, persons with disabilities, and Indigenous peoples. If you're a clean tech company, a utility, a regulator, local government, or a project developer, this program's for you. All the details are now online. Take a look. This is a big step forward in achieving our common mission: net zero emissions by 2050, a prosperous economy that creates good jobs, and a low carbon future that leaves no one behind. I know that's a lot. I know it's ambitious. But we're Canada. That's what we do. I wish you a very successful forum. Merci beaucoup.
Thank you, everybody. My name is Fred James. First of all, I'd like to start off by acknowledging we have people calling in from different locations, all of them located on Indigenous traditional territory. I'm coming to you from Vancouver on the unceded traditional territory of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh First Nations. I'd also like to again thank Siemens, who is sponsoring our panel number 2. Our second panel today features electricity stakeholders that are exploring new regulatory policies for disruptors, such as electric vehicle charging and distributed energy resources. With me today are Ahmed Faruqi, a principal in the Brattle Group. Ahmed is a rate design expert well known across North America. We also have Jennifer Hiscock, who is the Deputy Director, Smart Grid and Renewable Energy at Natural Resources Canada. John Todd is joining us, who is President of Elenchus Research Associates, Inc. And finally, we're pleased to have Mr. Mark Colasar, who's a public utility regulation expert and an affiliate of Christensen and Associates. So welcome, panel. I'm going to start off with 3 questions that I have provided to you in advance for comments by each of you. Our time is tight, so I'll apologize if I gently have to cut off some of our discussion. I do want to make sure we do have time to respond to some of the Slido questions that are coming into us from the panel. I'm going to first start with, I'm going to ask Ahmed to kick us off first with a question regarding activities close to his home in California. Ahmed, California has been in the regulatory spotlight lately with proceedings to develop a 3rd generation of net energy metering. This has come about due to concerns with cost shifting and cross-subsidization associated with existing policies. While we are not yet at the levels of net metering penetration in Canada, what do you think we need to do to be aware of as the take-up of rooftop solar and distributed energy resources in Canada increases?
Thank you very much. Great questions, and I'll do my best to address them. I do want to acknowledge that I have a Siemens charger for my electric car, so I thought I'd mention it. I'm located in the San Francisco Bay Area. As Fred mentioned, half of the US solar systems on rooftops are actually installed in California. So the question is why? Well, first of all, it is the largest state in the US. It has a lot of climate that is solar friendly, but the biggest reason is that it has very high electric rates. For example, in Northern California, where I live, the average rate is 28 cents per kilowatt hour. Lately, it has also become one of the least reliable states because of all kinds of reasons, many of which have been traced to inadequacies in the transmission system and the wildfires and all of that stuff. So at this point, we have 1.1 million rooftop solar systems in the state. The staff of the California Commission has estimated that rooftop solar currently is creating a cost shift between customers who have solar and those who don't have solar in the $3 billion range. Now, that's a staggering number, and it's a number that certainly has grabbed a lot of attention. In particular, the 3 investor-owned utilities are proposing some pretty radical changes in the net energy metering policy. It will not just lower the compensation that customers get for exporting power, it'll also charge them more for consuming power. And it may lead to a fixed charge that each customer with solar has to pay of somewhere between $80 and $120. This will have quite an impact on the solar industry and on customers planning to install solar once the change is approved. I should say if and when the change is approved. There are a lot of controversies, one of which is, will this be applied retroactively as well to the 1.1 million customers or just to the new customers? The solar industry, of course, is pushing back on it. They have been joined by other parties as well. And the main point I want to bring out today is that California has many cost shifts, not just a NEM cost shift. And Canada and the various provinces may or may not have some of these other cost shifts. In California, we have $1.5 billion being spent on energy efficiency. And that, of course, lowers customer usage and creates a cost shift between high users and low users. California has also got a low income subsidy of 35% on electric bills. It also has inclining block rates that create another 37% subsidy between small users and large users. And of course, there are the familiar rural-urban subsidies, apartments versus home subsidies. California also has very strong decarbonization goals, and in particular, it has a mandate for installing solar on all new homes built from 2020 onwards. So it's not an easy act to describe or to follow. It's a very complex puzzle, and we are waiting for the resolution.
Thank you, Ahmed. That's very interesting, and it does sound quite complicated. John, I'm going to turn to you to get your comments on this question.
Yeah, I'd like to pick up on the cost shifting and cross-subsidization part of the question as it links to Canada. As I think was even mentioned in the question, we have lower net metering penetration rates in Canada. That gives it a lower profile, but we have exactly the same issues. So the easy response is, well, let's just watch California and wait and see what they do and we can copy them. But the longer we wait, the more disruptive any corrective action will be. Corrective actions will be disruptive. The longer we wait, the more people are into net metering, the bigger the problems of getting out of it. The good news, given that the question is, what do we need to do to be aware? The good news is we understand the issues fully. I would commend to anybody listening on this call that they look at the Alberta Utility Commission's Alberta Electric Distribution System Connected Generation Inquiry's final report, which came out in December of 2017. It is a section 5331, read it, about with an illustrative example of the shifting that takes place with net billing and net metering. It's a nice, simple arithmetic example which demonstrates numerically the problem. It is linked specifically, in that case, to distribution costs, which are fixed, being recovered through an energy charge. They've also got a more recent report out, an inquiry for the Distribution System Inquiry, final report dated February 19th, 2021. It also explains not only this problem, but many of the issues that were being faced. That's a leading example in Canada of our understanding of the problems. The essence of the problem is that we are inviting uneconomic bypass. So we know what the problem is. Do we know the solutions? I'd say yes. Although those inquiries from the AUC were just reports on the problems, they were not decisions giving direction what to do, didn't lay out the solutions, but we know them. The simple answer is we've got to address uneconomic bypass. Payment should be structured based on avoided costs. We know how to do that. That's what CDM or IRP, or CDM in Ontario, DSM elsewhere, is based on. It uses IRP to come up with the avoided costs and figures out what is the appropriate price to pay for a megawatt. A megawatt of DSM is the same as a megawatt of generation. Both come from customers. A customer's megawatt equals a customer's megawatt. So that's the solution. Some of it will be location specific. We've got that one figured out too. We're looking at locational marginal pricing in Ontario, for example, for transmission. So we have all the tools we need to come up with the solutions. So we know the problems, we know the solutions, we just have to move ahead with it.
Thanks, John. Jennifer, over to you for some comments on this question.
Thanks, Fred. I don't have a ton to say on this topic, so I'll probably let the other speakers respond a bit more. But I will just acknowledge that when we're looking at a lot of these sort of technology trends that we're observing across the sector, it's something that will change over time. So at the beginning, where we see this challenge between like who pays and who benefits, it could be really unbalanced at the beginning, that a small portion of the rate base is actually benefiting from certain types of changes. But, you know, of the course of 2050, which isn't that many investment cycles, we expect to see that change significantly. So whatever we come up with needs to recognize like that dynamic and that need to be able to shift those calculations as these adoption models move through their normal distribution curves.
Great, thanks. You may raise a good point around the investment cycles and 2050 not being really that far off. It's not something a lot of people, I think, really think about. Mark, I'm going to turn to you to have your comments on this question.
Yeah, I won't say a lot because I think Todd's obviously touched on what's the real heart of the issue, and that is how do you get the right price signals into the market so that you don't end up in a situation where you've got costs being basically shifted. And I think, we all know how to get there. The issue is how do you get there? And I think that we need to start thinking about how we deconstruct the traditional utility model. And when we talk about, the fact that all the changes appear to be on the edge of the grid, one of the things that we need to think about is what's the definition of a utility? Is the very definition of what a utility is it gradually changing as a result of what we see going on in the market? And if that's true, then you have to ask yourself what needs to be regulated and how should it be regulated? And that's, I think, really at the heart of all the issues that we've heard talked about throughout the entire day here. And I think we'll have a chance to get back to that discussion when we explore some of the other questions. And I guess the other question that I might take back to Ahmad is, do you know which costs are being actually shifted in the California case?
Great question. I think there's a lot of controversy on what costs are being shifted, but the basic concept is distribution costs in particular are the ones being avoided. But if I can just expand on that a little bit, the gist of the problem is the rate design, as I think the other speakers have mentioned as well. It's volumetric in nature. It doesn't include an element for distribution separately or for transmission. Everything is lumped into California. The IOUs don't even have a fixed charge. The fixed charge is $0. And that is true for 10 million customers, not just the 1.1 million who have solar. So the first thing they need to do, and everyone knows this and nobody wants to do it, right? The lack of willpower is astounding. They need to fix the rate design for all 10 million customers. Why just pick on the 1.1 million solar? And I say that partly as an economist, partly as a solar customer with storage, right? So you could say I have a certain bias there. But the reality is, on my court of 10 homes, there are 4 with solar. On a street down from me, there are 50% of the homes have solar. Their issue is the high cost of energy. And that is the fundamental problem. It's affecting the 10 million, not just the 1.1 million. One other quick comment I would make is to fix the cost shift. Let's fix the rate design. But if that's immensely complicated because of the politics, then let's divide the prosumer into a consumer and a producer. Let's deal with them separately. For consumption, they should be on the same rate as everyone else. Why discriminate, right? Why be blatantly upset that somebody has become self-generating? Well, focus on the export, the price they're being paid for export. Yes, that might be higher than your avoided cost. So let's fix that. But what they're trying to do right now is do all of that and just focus on solar. And it has become politically charged and probably at some point will fail or blow up or something worse.
So is the fundamental problem with net metering the original concept that when the customer draws from the grid, they create a cost, but when they export their power, their excess power onto the grid, they're actually benefiting the electric utility. And I think when net metering first came into play, that's what the concept was. But it seems that what we're saying here is that's actually not true.
Well, there is controversy on how much of a benefit does the grid get from the exported power. As you probably have seen, there are so many studies on the value of solar. There's a new one coming out every 6 months or so. So basically, there are people who contend that you avoid the transmission lines that you otherwise would be building. It's localized, it's on the customer's property. And at times the grid has a shortage. And then this exported power could play a role in mitigating that shortage. So there is no easy answer. It's complex, it's location specific. But to argue that there is no value to the grid of having solar, there's only a drain on the grid, then it's a cost shift, makes it look like it's a black ball of some kind. And I think that's what you're seeing play out in California. The problem is so huge, they don't know how to tackle it. So they're trying to say it's a dinosaur, it needs to be put to rest.
Thanks, Ahmed. I think our next question sort of also will touch on this in terms of it's focusing on smart grids and how that might be able to help us out here. And I'm going to ask Jennifer to start off with response to this question. So hi, Jennifer. Following on from considerations of increased rooftop solar and distributed energy resources, the smart grid may or should have a role to play in how utilities manage these resources. We already have heard from Melanie comment in her fireside chat with Indy on the need to make our grid smarter. What do you see as examples of good regulatory practice with regard to the smart grid and the full potential to be realized by utilities who have smart metering technology and smart grid capability? And I guess, the question is, are the utilities doing enough themselves to realize the full potential from smart grids?
Thanks, Fred. So I think you've asked two distinct questions here. So remember that when you're running the clock here.
Okay, fair enough.
The first is on good regulatory practice, and the second is on what utilities are doing. So to your first question on regulatory practice, we're just starting to dig into this with our Innovation and Electricity Regulation Initiative, which we launched last fall to try to understand how our federal programs might better support innovation within the regulatory context. I want to pause on that just for a moment because, our last panel really talked a lot about how a lot of the regulatory institutions and structures that we have in place and practices around that were really based on 20th century needs, and it's not fitting what the needs are that we have right now. But at the same time, coming at this from a federal government perspective, where energy regulation is not our jurisdiction in most cases, I'm really coming at this from a programs perspective. And so, yes, I think there's probably a lot of the conversation that needs to have that needs to happen around the legislative context and the mandates that are given these regulators. But from a programs perspective, and looking at 2050 and how many investment cycles we have to get there, we want to avoid this chicken and egg of fixing the entire house before we do anything. So from that perspective, we're learning that a lot of these regulatory barriers, when looking at the 4Ds, tend to be either policy or legislative barriers, or they have to do with figuring out the value of something. And we were just talking about that with solar and DERs. And so that doesn't deflect all of the attention away from regulators. In fact, we're seeing some good examples of productive relationships between policymaking and regulatory process. The AUC distribution inquiry, which John mentioned earlier, is one example where they're methodically and transparently supporting stakeholder engagement. On the valuation of benefits, sometimes we're finding you just need a project to start to figure that out. And the NSUARB's innovation justification criteria that Jennifer referred to earlier is applying that against a project that we're funding from the Smart Grid program. So I don't want to mismanage the expectations for any direct policy response that might happen to these projects and explorations and inquiries, but it does highlight how effective some of the tools are that are at the regulator's disposal to explore the messiness of this energy sector transformation process and the role that electricity will play and the role that utilities will play. And while creating a vision is not the job of a regulator, certainly they have tools to help us figure these things out. And your second question on what utilities are doing, I think the quick answer in Canada is that they're doing more and more, but they're still not doing enough to realize the full potential of smart grids. And for us, that question of enough looks at the degree to which innovation projects are integrated into their broader system planning and strategies. So some of the most ambitious projects we've supported in terms of how this is factoring into utility planning and institutional structures are coming out of our municipal utilities, like St. John Energy, who today is receiving an International Award of Excellence in the Clean Energy Material for their Smart Energy project, which is integrating DERs into the balancing services of their Smart Control Center. So in answer to your question of enough, it really has to do with how these projects that are the innovation projects and the experimentation for that, or how these other processes more in the public arena, are feeding back into the utility strategic planning and their organizational transformation. And while I don't think we're seeing enough for 2050, I'm really encouraged.
Great, thanks, Jennifer. I would like to now ask Ahmed to respond to Jennifer's comments.
I think what she has laid out is really very comprehensive. In many ways, that's exactly the kind of response we need. The reality is these changes, the 4Ds, are very real. We cannot wish them away. They are being driven by forces beyond our control. They're social forces, they're consumers, there's the organic taste concept. There's also the desire. I've even seen in places like Quebec, people wanting to put solar on their roof. And you wonder, what's the payback period? People are buying cars where electricity is very expensive, like in Hawaii, right? You kind of wonder, why are they buying electric cars in Hawaii? Well, because the gasoline prices are also high. So there's always some driver. And just about every forecast I'm seeing now is for solar, for community choice, for electric cars is up and up. There's also electric heat pumps, which perhaps has not been explicitly mentioned, but it's part of the decarbonization movement. These will, in a sense, unless we change our rate design, they can threaten our business model, our ability as utilities to survive the transition. So I think for too long, as we all know, we have said, well, let's kick the can down the road. Let's leave it to the next board, the next commission, the next governor. And in the meantime, 4 decades have come and gone. It can't go on like that. Change has to be accepted. We have to accept it and move ahead of it.
Great, thanks, Ahmed. Mark, any comments on this question?
Yeah, I was going to jump in and say that I think one of the real challenges for utilities and grid modernization is a concern that, are they going to be able to really recover the cost? I mean, there's a lot of money has to be spent to fully modernize the grid. And as we see all the changes that are ultimately coming, part of the challenge, I think, for a lot of the utilities is, will the grid modernization give me enough of an opportunity from a purely business perspective to better engage with my customers in a way that's going to allow me to deal with the fact that I am going to be I'm going to be gradually losing my revenue base. And so I think part of the challenge is, I can spend a lot of money doing grid modernization, but will the regulator let me recover those costs? And whether the regulator lets me recover them or not, am I going to be in a position to get enough of a business benefit from being able to actually do that? So just let me give you one really small example here. If you look at Europe, they already have peer-to-peer trading platforms there. Utilities have already implemented them. You have the growth of energy communities and microgrids, and it's a totally different picture than what we have here. There's one utility that I'm aware of in the North American market that's put in a peer-to-peer platform, and that's Green Mountain Power. That's it, one. So I think it's very challenging for utilities in the market today to try to make a decision about how much they want to spend on grid modernization, because there's a risk for their shareholder about what that payback's going to be and whether they're going to ultimately be able to pay it back. So I think that's potentially a big part of the problem.
Yeah, no, thanks. Thank you, Mark. John, over to you for some comments on Jennifer's question, or comments, I should say.
Yes, I mean, looking at good utility practice, what utilities are doing, good regulatory practice. I want to lever off of what Marcus just said. But first, for good practice, we have to understand the difference. I think we do, but we don't spend enough time thinking about it. The difference between smart meters, advanced metering infrastructure, and smart grid. Smart meters are just a meter that records usage in small time increments. It's nothing. It's not a serious innovation, but it's foundational for advanced metering infrastructure, which takes those smart meters and creates a two-way communication system for the grid. That's an information system, which in itself has little value until you get to smart grid, which is utilizing that, both in terms of the AMI itself and in terms of all the stuff you can connect into a grid. The smart grid is a platform. We have to think of that as being like building a highway. If we had to justify every highway by saying, you know, how is it going to be used? Where's the value going to come from that benefits society? We would never be able to get to a regular hearing that shows that the benefits outweigh the costs. We probably wouldn't have any highways. Tough thing to say. But justifying a smart grid is just as difficult, because by building a platform, you're opening up the possibilities. And we can't even envisage all the possibilities that are even 2 years down the road, let alone 5 or 10 years down the road. It does take a bit of a leap of faith, sort of like building a transcontinental railway. That was a leap of faith. That was not a cost-benefit analysis. And ultimately, it's going that route. So, and I think as the previous comments said, the utilities will bear the cost of building a smart grid. In the new world, a lot of non-utilities will monetize or get the benefit from that smart grid. So how do we justify the cost? It's either based on social benefit and it's somehow subsidized, or we have to go like Highway 407 in Ontario. Let's privatize and have the equivalent of road tolls, you know, grid tolls, to say there's got to be a payback to the utilities. That may lead to privatization. That requires, you know, thinking differently. I love the old Apple, early Apple concept, think different, with a picture of Einstein. What we need to do now, and what will be good utility practice in my view, is to think different about everything we do as utilities, as regulators, as policymakers.
Thanks for that, John. Jennifer, I believe you wanted to respond to one of Mark's comments.
Yeah, thanks. Just in reference to the European comparison and what we're seeing out of Green Mountain Power, we are funding a project actually by Electra that's getting into peer-to-market, so not quite peer-to-peer yet, but we are experimenting with those technologies in Canada as well. But in general, I think, you know, you see a lot in the European context with their very, I don't want to say well, there is a lot of competition at the retail level. And so their structures where they've separated out, you know, generation from transmission and distribution and retail, you only see that really in one province in Canada. But you do see that separation also in Ontario. And so I think this DNO to DSO transition that we're seeing play out, that seems to favor a lot of the market pathways that tend to come with a lot of the digitalization and decentralization and democratization, which all has to do with all of these other players coming into our planning and our delivery of power in the future, tends to be associated with those types of models, which could, you know, look like the utility death spiral. But I don't think it's, you know, when you look at what people talk about when they're looking at DNO to DSO transition, there's still a really important and critical role for utilities to play there. And it's just not, it is the business models, like you mentioned, which are really going to be changing, but this doesn't necessarily cut them off from revenues. So I think that, you know, the project that we're funding right now with Electra and the ISO to look at a non-wires alternative where they're putting in distribution level markets to leverage customer assets right now just for capacity, but in future, they can look at experimenting with these types of models for other grid services. It's required a lot of shift in thinking for Electra, who has been the DNO equivalent, the monopoly owner of the poles and wires and deliverer of all those services. Now, they're really thinking about, okay, what does this mean when I'm an unbiased market authority? And how do I operate in this respect? But I don't think that Electra looks at this as a threat necessarily to their business and to their future. So it's something that we're all exploring. And there's a lot of vertically integrated utilities in Canada. And so I think we have to see how this model starts to play out in areas where you are a vertically integrated utility. But I think there can be an effective role for private sector in providing some of these connective services between customer assets that customers will pay for, not necessarily ratepayers, and the services that will ultimately be up to some kind of utility authority to integrate and balance to maintain reliability.
Oh, great. Thank you. Thanks for that follow-up. You mentioned the utility death spiral, and that sort of feeds into the third prepared question I had sent out to the panel ahead of time. I'm going to ask Mark to lead off on this one. And Mark, I think we should also be considering the electric utilities, as we've heard about, and their duty to serve obligation in the emerging environment where prosumers and others are putting demands on the utility grid. This drives utility costs up, meanwhile enabling tariff avoidance or an economic bypass, given existing utility rate structures. This also raises the problem of the potential utility death spiral, which Jennifer just mentioned, that we often do hear about. And in such an environment, should the utility actually need to maintain the obligation to serve? That's a pretty big question. And if it does, how will that be financed?
You're right, that is a really big one. And if we had all day, we probably wouldn't be able to ultimately solve it. But let me come back to— We got 5 minutes. Let me come back to one of the things that I said, and that is, do we need to really rethink what the definition of a utility is? And I think that one of the questions that we want to ask ourselves is if the grid itself is a natural monopoly, and I think, we can probably all agree that that is, and arguably, if generation and retail electricity are really ultimately contestable markets, then is the utility function really the provision of services on the grid? Is that the utility function and not what attaches to the edge of the grid? And if we start thinking along those terms, then you start thinking about, well, what does that mean for the obligation to serve? Does the obligation to serve really come down to an obligation to connect generation and load and to carry the electrons? And does the retail provider of last resort have to be the owner of that grid? Or can others in the market who actually may be in a very good position to become a provider of last resort at the retail end, can that obligation potentially shift? And then with respect to the death spiral, well, I think the big question, as we've already talked about, is how do we price utility services? And as has already been mentioned, to the extent that current rate structures try to recover growing and fixed grid costs with variable rates, you start running into the potential for the death spiral that we all seem to want to try to figure out how to fix, which is as you start to lose more and more of your revenue base as a utility, you're going to be affected because you're trying to recover your grid costs from variable rates. And as we all know, that's not going to work out very well. So getting the right price signals into the market, I think, is very important. I think we all know that. That's going to raise questions about affordability, questions about energy poverty, but there are ways we can ultimately deal with that. I know what a lot of jurisdictions have done is gone to universal service funding. That's potentially one option. So I come back to the idea that, do we need to start to deconstruct the traditional utility model and think about what that utility business model looks like in a different way, and start rethinking how we define what the utility really is? And I think somewhere in all that is where the answer lies. But I'll toss it back to the rest of our panel to see what they think.
Okay, thanks, Mark. I'm actually going to just maybe change tactics here a little bit, as we have about 10 or 15 minutes left. Maybe I'll ask if any one of the panels has a strong response they'd like to make to Mark. If not, I'd like to maybe jump to some questions from the audience, and we can get into those. Okay, so maybe I'll jump to some audience questions we have here first. So first question is the regulator, I'm not sure who this will go to, is the regulator, maybe I'll start with you, Mark, is the regulator considering to add reactive voltage charges to the prosumer's bill?
I'm not sure I can respond to that. I'm no longer a regulator.
Right.
But to the extent that it's been generally accepted that you need to get your rates to be cost-based, and you need to get the right price signals into the market. If in fact reactive power is an issue when you have a solar installation that has to be managed, then that cost obviously has to be recovered, and the best option is always to recover the cost from he or she who causes that cost. So if that's the case, then there's a good argument that in fact utilities should be recovering the cost of reactive power from those who have a solar installation.
So I agree, but I would also say that there are certain barriers in place preventing that from happening in a way that customers could. So there's not necessarily the contract flexibility that would allow customers who are trying to connect to the grid with solar, with smart inverters that can provide a lot of those reactive power services and prevent a lot of the power quality issues that we see from distributed generation on the distribution system. So I agree, the customer should pay, but if there's no kind of contract flexibility for them to provide, curtail some of the services that right now they only have a contract for energy, so there's zero disincentive for them to solve the problems they're causing, then you're taking it off their bill. And so I think that there is something that can be done to try to make that cost more recoverable in a financing package for these solutions. So it doesn't just come on as a disincentive. So you want to put solar on your roof, here's your bill adder to compensate for your problems. It's why not let us just put smart solar on the roof so it doesn't cause problems?
Yeah, it has not come up in the California conversations, but what has come up is a grid access charge to account for all kinds of issues. So I'll just make a brief comment there.
So if the answer is as you suggest, doesn't that now create an incentive for the individual who has solar to take whatever steps they can in order to avoid that extra cost? So don't you get the result that you ultimately want?
Yeah, I would hope. But some of it is a little bit just how rapidly the technology is improving. But Ontario connected a whole lot of feed-in tariff projects with not smart inverters. And the contract was only set up purely for the kilowatt hour payment of energy. So I think maybe today it would be harder to install a solar project that doesn't have an inverter with those capabilities. But in a lot of cases, they're just not turned on because nobody is asking them to, and nobody is offering to pay for the services, or in exchange for what could be an adder onto your bill. allow them to turn those services on, so that it's going to reduce your overall kilowatt hours that you're compensated for. But is that contract flexibility even there for you to do that?
How many solar installations are there in Ontario?
Oh, that's a good question. So Ontario's distributed energy resources are in the 4,000 megawatt mark. That is not all solar, but it has, like, that's the size of a nuke. So it's the largest contingency. I don't know the number of projects though.
But what I was saying was, is this issue even worth talking about? It was such a small number that you can't remember the number.
So yeah, you're right. I mean, it's not causing big problems on Ontario's grid right now. So it's not necessarily something that we need to lament so much, but I don't think we need to throw this up as a barrier that needs to show up that needs to be charged back in a separate creation of a new adder on the customer's bill. I feel like, going ahead, moving forward now, that we can address this issue so that we don't create more problems. But you're right, on the existing grid, it's not causing.
I think more and more of the new inverters being sold are smart inverters. So the technology is changing. Maybe 10, 15 years ago, when the feed-in tariffs were active, it didn't exist. But I have not seen a net metering tariff with a reactive voltage charge. It's one of the smaller issues. There's so many bigger issues.
Yeah.
There's one, I'd like to just jump in with another audience question, and it seems to kind of summarize a lot of what we've been talking about here. And I think all of us can respond to this, or all of you can respond to this. What is the optimum rate structure or rate design for distribution and transmission going forward? What are your thoughts on that? Maybe I'll start with you, Ahmed.
I certainly think the volumetric structure is not appropriate. So we can all agree that volumetric doesn't work. The question is it a fixed charge, or is it a fixed charge and a demand charge based on capacity? And if it is a demand charge, it is coincident demand or non-coincident demand. And does it vary by time of day, or does it not vary by time of day? I think those are the options available. Now, in some cases, and certainly I'm aware of Ontario, they have a flat bill for distribution, totally fixed. And I think that's certainly one way to approach it. Texas was looking at that as well. The idea was, why should you pay a volumetric charge for something that doesn't vary volumetrically? But the question arises, shouldn't it be specific to your connection and to the size of your, the amps? And then the answer is, most of us don't know what the connection size is. But it's certainly not a volumetric charge. So it's some combination of a fixed bill with a demand charge. That's my opinion, at least.
Okay, thanks. Thanks, Ahmed. John, I'll turn to you because you haven't had a chance to say too much lately.
Thanks. As it happened, I was facilitating a process for the Ontario Energy Board, must have been about 5 or 6 years ago, on rate design, addressing exactly these issues. How do you go from an energy charge to a demand charge, or some sort of charge to the capacity of a customer system, if not their demand? And there were huge technical reasons why that was an impediment. I think with technical change that may be changing, but we should be talking about where we want to get to, sort of an end state. And we shouldn't slow ourselves down because they're saying, oh, it's a very small problem now. Going back to your comments, Jennifer, in response to Ahmed, something may be a small problem today, doesn't mean we don't address it because it will become a big problem in the future. Same thing with net metering, as we talked about in Canada. Small problem, if you don't fix it, it's going to become a big problem. Also, they're really all the same problem. If we come up with a solution, cost-based charges, and say that's going to be our principle, as the new issues come along, we keep getting into smart rate design. And that may require some technology evolution, but unless we look ahead of where we want to end up, we're not going to be getting the metering and the other information flows that we need in order to have the smart solution in 5 years. So let's look ahead and let's start evolving our system to where it's going to have to be in 5 years or 10 years, because it takes a long time to get transitions. I think my big example is, are we going to have people putting dumb electric vehicle charging equipment in their garages? Or are we going to set a standard so that when somebody has electric vehicle charging, it's connected to the local distributor or some other control center to make sure that becomes part of our grid storage, that every electric vehicle is a distributed energy resource. And we will not get there unless we set standards today so that everything coming to market is right. And I say, let's not think about these things for the next 5 years. Let's act now.
Yeah, no, good point. Jennifer, do you have a response to that or any comments to lead on to that?
A couple quick ones. So our minister just announced before this the SREPS program, which is trying to do exactly that. So every application that anybody has to fill in for any established or emerging technologies that they want to connect is going to have to be able to demonstrate to us how it can provide grid services, whether or not the markets exist or the contract flexibility is there in provinces. But we don't want to have these assets become stranded assets in our future. We want them to be able to be leveraged by the grid wherever they are. So one is like, John, hopefully that makes you a little happy anyway to see that we are trying to act immediately on that front. Otherwise, so flexible rate design and being able to send those types of signals to customers. I think we've had a few pilots in these areas by a number of utilities across the country, and they've been great results. So this is an area where as the federal government, like, we really don't get involved, but you have to get these signals out somehow. It's something else that I've seen going into, FERC proceedings and in the Australia markets is looking at how you can create incentive structures for utilities to realize savings. So that when they're coming in with their proposals, the non-wires alternatives can actually be much more competitive. So, volumetric and fixed, but there's also like, what kind of incentive or reward do you get for coming in under what the alternative cost could have been?
Thank you. There's one final question just come in. We have about 4 minutes left. And this question I find quite interesting. Another one we could probably spend the afternoon talking about, but shouldn't the focus be on rates that incent efficient customer behavior and not on treating rate design as an accounting exercise? And I can sort of see that coming from, whether you are working in a utility or maybe working as John does, or, or Ahmed looking at rate design. But I'm going to throw that one out. Who wants to take a stab at that question?
I have a quick response. Absolutely correct. I think a lot of rate design has been an accounting exercise based on embedded costs for way too long. Yesterday's realities, tomorrow's future is not even considered. And what is amazing is I try to bring out the role of customer centricity in rate design, giving them choices. I was at a senior executive meeting of utilities. Halfway into my presentation on that topic, one of them raised their hand, the chief operating officer of a good-sized utility. And his question to me was, what's in it for us? I was stunned. It's sort of like, when I pretended not to understand the question, wanted to be polite. I said, I'm sorry, I'm not following what you're saying. And he said, I need the revenue. Where is the revenue coming from? I said, by being customer centric, you'll have happier customers. You'll have happier commissions. They will approve your revenue requirements case more quickly. I didn't know what else to tell him. He had an accountant's mind. And there are so many of our industry executives, and I'm not going to mention any names. We know who they are. They are living in their own world. They have to please the shareholders. And they are panicked big time that sales are falling. Sales growth has disappeared. They're hoping that electrification with cars and heat pumps will come in, but they don't realize that somebody else might be providing that house that electricity and not the utility. So I really think unless we focus on the customer and incent behavior, the death spiral, which I have been told never to mention, we're mentioning today, will become a reality. We are going to bring it about by being caught in the past.
One of the things that I think the utilities really struggle with is, if I'm going to have a significant redesign of my rate structure, I need to be able to mine the information in order to be able to do that. And because they're grounded in the traditional way that utilities account for all their costs, they simply don't have the data to be able to do what they need to do to send the right price signals out. And there's a big leap of faith that has to happen for them to now incur all the costs to be able to do that. And I just don't, see that a lot of utilities are prepared to, take that leap of faith at this point, because they're not sure they're going to be able to ultimately recover the tremendous costs that they're going to have to incur. And I'm not sure I know the answer, but I think that's where part of the problem ultimately lies.
So I think we have time for one quick comment, John, and then I'm going to have to cut you off.
Okay. I see the comments on the death spiral and the response to it, and I'm reminded of the comedy scene in All That Jazz about the 5 stages of death. Where are we in the 5 stages? The first stage is denial. We hear a lot of denial. I've been hearing denial for 10 years. I'm still hearing denial. The second stage is anger. We hear a lot of that too. A lot of people are still there. The third stage is bargaining. Go to the regulator and say, protect us from competition and we will give you good service. So bargaining is the third stage. We haven't got past that. The fourth stage is depression, which is giving up. I've certainly seen some of that. The fifth stage is acceptance. Acceptance says I'm going to a better place. This is going to be a new place where we've got competition between the grid and non-grid. And I'm going to adapt to that, and I'm going to exploit that, and I'm going to be successful at that, and I'm going to be like Bell Canada, which used to be a monopoly, and learn to adapt to competition, and is now, one of the richest corporations in Canada because they learned to compete, although they started off as a monopoly. And until we do that in this industry, until we reach acceptance, the fifth stage, and start responding in that way, we're going to be in trouble.
Thanks, John. That's a great analogy for us to sort of wrap up our panel today. I want to thank all 4 of you for being here today. I think it was a very, very good discussion, very, very lively. We heard some diverse views. And again, thank you to Siemens for sponsoring panel number 2. And I'm going to turn it back over to Francis.
All right, outstanding. Thank you very much. Thank you for a terrific panel. I'd like to thank everybody for joining us today. Thank you to the CEA team, Justin Cruson, Danielle Vezina, and Farhan Mirza for their work behind the scenes in pulling this together. Thank you also to CEA's Economic Regulation Committee and the Distribution Council for steering this event. Thank you to the chair and vice chairs of our ERIC committee for moderating our panels, including Indy Bhutani D'Souza from Electra, Fred James from BC Hydro, and Curtis Hildebrandt from NMAX. And thank you again to our event sponsors, to CAMPUT and to Natural Resources Canada, event partners rather, and thank you to our sponsors, to Dominion High Voltage and to Siemens. We hope you can join us next year for an in-person, 3-dimensional event following the CAMPUT annual conference. Thank you for joining us today. Good day.